It was past midnight when she leaned over my desk, her voice low and steady. "Don't look away," she said. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer just work. The office was almost silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Everyone else had already gone home, their desks sitting in neat, abandoned rows. I was the only one left, hunched over a pile of reports, my pen tapping in quiet rhythm as I tried to stay focused. Then I heard it, heels. Slow, unhurried, confident. The sound carried across the empty space, each step echoing a little louder in the silence. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. There was only one person in this building who moved with that kind of composure, my boss. She was in her early 40s, though you wouldn't know it from the way she carried herself. There was something about her presence, graceful, assured, the kind that made people straighten up the moment she entered a room. And yet, in the stillness of the late night, she seemed softer somehow, less like the commanding figure everyone feared, and more like a woman just lingering in thought. I kept my eyes on the page, but my heart gave me away. It beat faster, heavier, like it wanted to announce her arrival before I dared to acknowledge it. Her steps grew closer until I felt her shadow stretch across my desk. I finally looked up, and there she was, standing right beside me, her arms loosely folded, a faint smile curving her lips as she glanced at the stack of papers I'd been working on. "You're still here," she said, her voice low and even. Not sharp, not managerial, just noticing. I swallowed and nodded. "I wanted to finish this section tonight." She tilted her head, studying me. For a moment, she didn't speak, and in that pause, I became acutely aware of everything. The faint scent of her perfume, warm and elegant. The way a strand of her dark hair had slipped forward to frame her cheek. The subtle shift of her weight as she leaned one hand on the edge of my desk. The distance between us shrank to nothing. I could hear the faint rustle of her blouse as she moved, see the fine details in her necklace catching the dim light. My shoulders stiffened when the edge of her sleeve brushed mine ever so lightly. It wasn't deliberate, I don't think, but the effect was undeniable. It sent a shiver up my arm, grounding me in the reality that she was right here. She leaned forward, her gaze flicking from the papers to me, and for the first time, her eyes lingered. They didn't just glance, they held. It was the kind of look that seemed to see past the surface, past the formality of employee and boss, straight into something I wasn't sure I was ready to admit. In that moment, the office didn't feel like an office anymore. It felt smaller, warmer, like the air itself had shifted. Her presence filled it completely. And though she hadn't said anything more, I already knew something had changed. She didn't step back. Instead, she leaned a little closer, resting one hand on the corner of my desk. The gesture was simple, casual even, but the way her body angled toward mine made the space between us feel impossibly small. I shifted slightly in my chair, fighting the instinct to retreat, to look down at the papers in front of me. But her presence drew me in like gravity. "You've been at this for hours," she said, her voice quiet, measured. There was no criticism in her tone, only observation. But there was something else in her eyes, something I couldn't quite define. Curiosity, maybe. A hint of amusement. A softness I hadn't seen before. "I don't mind," I answered quickly. My voice was steadier than I felt. "It's important." She tilted her head, studying me in silence. Her hair slipped forward, brushing against her cheek, and I caught the faintest trace of her perfume, warm, elegant, almost soothing. She reached across me to point at a line in the document, her sleeve grazing my arm. The contact was so light it could have been accidental, but it lingered in my awareness like a spark. When I instinctively looked down, trying to gather myself, she spoke again. "Don't look away." The words were gentle but firm, spoken with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. My eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. It wasn't just a look. It was a challenge, a quiet command. Her gaze held mine steady, unwavering. The longer it lasted, the more exposed I felt, as if she were reading not just the expression on my face, but the thoughts I was trying to hide. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened. I told myself to breathe, but even that felt too loud, too obvious in the silence between us. She didn't smile, not quite, but there was a curve at the corner of her mouth, the faintest suggestion that she knew exactly what she was doing to me. And maybe she did. I wanted to look away again, to give myself a chance to escape the weight of her stare. But something inside me refused. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was desire. Maybe it was simply the way her eyes seemed to strip away the layers I usually kept so carefully in place. The office around us faded into background noise, the hum of the lights, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint creak of my chair beneath me. None of it mattered. What mattered was the intensity of the moment, the unspoken tension stretching taut between us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she shifted back ever so slightly, though her hand still rested on the desk near mine. "Better," she said softly, almost as if she were rewarding me. I didn't know what game we had just started, or if it was a game at all. But I knew this. I wasn't going to forget the way she looked at me. Not tonight, not ever. When she finally stepped back, the silence she left behind felt louder than any words she could have spoken. The office was the same. Papers scattered, monitors glowing softly, the steady hum of electricity filling the air, but inside me, something had shifted. I sat there, pen still in hand, but I wasn't writing anymore. My eyes followed her without meaning to, tracing the line of her figure as she moved toward her desk across the room. There was no rush in her steps. She carried herself with the same composed grace as always, but now, every detail seemed magnified. The subtle sway of her hair as it brushed her shoulders, the faint rustle of fabric as she adjusted her blouse before sitting down. Even the sound of her chair creaking softly when she leaned back seemed intimate somehow, like it belonged only to the two of us in this late-night world. I tried to look back at my papers, to pretend that nothing had happened. But the memory of her eyes, steady and unflinching, lingered too strongly. Her words, "Don't look away," still echoed in my chest, making my heart beat in a rhythm that refused to settle. And then, almost without warning, our eyes met again. I hadn't realized she was watching me. I caught her reflection first, faint and ghostly in the glass wall beside her. The city lights outside glowed dimly, casting her silhouette in soft outlines. When I looked up, she was already looking at me, her gaze calm but unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't a long stare this time, just a moment, a brush of connection, like a hand grazing yours in passing. But it was enough to remind me that what had happened at my desk wasn't an accident, and it wasn't forgotten. I forced my attention back to the numbers in front of me, trying to lose myself in the neat rows of ink. Yet every sense betrayed me. The glow of her desk lamp spilled across the floor, a pool of golden light that reached toward me. The faint scratch of her pen against paper carried through the quiet, rhythmic and steady, reminding me she was still there. Even the sound of her breathing, barely audible, seemed to blend with the atmosphere of the room, steadying and unsteadying me all at once. Minutes passed like hours. Every time I felt her glance flicker my way, my chest tightened. And every time I risked a quick look in her direction, I found myself wondering if she felt the same, if the silence between us pressed on her as heavily as it did on me. There were no words spoken, no lines crossed. Just two people working late, at least on the surface. But beneath it, something deeper was stirring. Something that had nothing to do with reports or deadlines. By the time I bent my head to write again, my pen trembled faintly in my fingers. I wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or the afterglow of being seen in a way I hadn't expected by someone I couldn't stop thinking about. The clock on the wall ticked quietly past midnight. My eyes burned from staring too long at the same report, and for the first time all night, I pushed back my chair and rubbed my temples. I figured a short break might clear the fog in my head. The office kitchen was dim, lit only by the underglow of a small fluorescent strip above the counter. The silence felt different here, more relaxed, less charged than the main floor. I filled a mug with coffee, the dark liquid steaming as it poured. Behind me, I heard her footsteps again, softer this time, slower, almost hesitant. When I turned, she was leaning against the doorway, arms folded, watching me. "Still at it?" she asked, her voice quiet, but carrying a note of something else. Curiosity, maybe. I gave a small smile. "I guess I don't know when to stop." She walked into the room, her heels muted against the tile, and reached for a mug. I handed her mine without thinking, and she accepted it with a faintly surprised look. Her fingers brushed mine as she took it. Just a passing touch, but the warmth of her skin lingered long after. For a moment, she just stood there, holding the mug between her hands, letting the steam rise to her face. Then, almost as though she hadn't planned to say it, she spoke. You know, not many people put in this kind of effort. Most do what they need to, nothing more. But you. She paused, searching my eyes. You remind me of when I first started. Hungry, determined, maybe even a little reckless with how much you give. Her honesty caught me off guard. I laughed softly, shaking my head. I don't think I've ever been compared to reckless before. Intimidated, maybe. Especially by you. Her brows lifted slightly, and then she let out a laugh, softer than the polished, professional tone I was used to. It was warmer, unguarded. The sound filled the small kitchen, and before I knew it, I was smiling with her. You find me intimidating? She asked, tilting her head. I hesitated, then nodded. In the best way. You set a standard, one I'm not sure I'll ever reach. Something shifted in her expression then. The confidence remained, but beneath it, I caught a flicker of vulnerability. She lowered her gaze for just a second, tracing her thumb along the rim of the cup. Her hand grazed my wrist lightly as she handed the mug back. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a quiet jolt through me. My skin tingled where her fingers had brushed, and for a moment, I wondered if she felt it too. The silence stretched comfortably this time. No tension, no unspoken challenge, just a quiet acknowledgement of something real, something human, between us. I took a slow breath, the warmth of the coffee settling in my hands. But it wasn't the drink that made me feel awake. It was her, standing there, close enough to touch, yet holding herself just far enough away that I knew we hadn't crossed a line. Not yet, but it was coming. We walked back to the main office together, her heels clicking softly against the floor, my footsteps deliberately slower to match her pace. Neither of us spoke, but the silence didn't feel awkward. It felt heavy, charged, as though the air between us carried more than words could say. When we reached our desks, the illusion of routine returned. She sat across from me, papers spread neatly in front of her, and I lowered myself into my chair with an exaggerated focus, pen in hand. From the outside, we must have looked like nothing more than two people working late, quietly committed to finishing what we had started. But on the inside, everything had changed. Every time she shifted in her chair, I noticed. The faint rustle of her blouse as she leaned forward to write, the soft creak of leather when she leaned back. It all pulled at my attention no matter how hard I tried to concentrate. Even the subtle way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear seemed magnified in the quiet. I caught myself staring more than once. Once at the delicate curve of her hand as she wrote in steady lines. Another time at the way her lips pressed together slightly when she focused. Each glance was quick, stolen, but each one left me restless, aware of the dangerous edge I was walking. And then it happened. She caught me. Her eyes lifted from the page and locked with mine across the distance of our desks. Not for long, just a second too long, but enough. My pen froze mid-sentence, my breath catching in my chest. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smirk or raise an eyebrow. She simply looked at me as though she already knew what I was thinking and was waiting to see what I would do about it. I looked down quickly, pretending to write again, but my hand trembled slightly, betraying me. The silence between us thickened. Every sound seemed louder, the scratching of her pen, the soft clicking of my keyboard, the muted hum of the lights overhead. The office felt smaller, as though the walls had moved closer, as though there was no space wide enough to contain the tension threading through the air. At one point, she stood to reach for a file on the cabinet behind me. As she passed, the faint brush of her perfume trailed with her, warm and familiar. I kept my eyes on the screen in front of me, but every part of me was aware of her nearness. The slight sway of her skirt as she moved, the heat of her presence when she leaned briefly beside me to retrieve the file. And then she was gone again, back to her seat, as if nothing had happened. But something had, because the distance between us, physical, professional, unspoken, wasn't real anymore. It was a boundary we were both pretending to respect, while quietly, silently, we tested how close we could come without breaking it. And I knew it was only a matter of time before one of us would. By the time I closed the last file, the office was quiet enough that even the sound of paper sliding into a folder seemed loud. The clock above the glass wall read nearly 1 in the morning. My body was tired, but my mind refused to rest. I packed my bag slowly, almost reluctantly. Part of me didn't want to leave yet. as though the night still held something unfinished. And then her voice stopped me. Wait. It wasn't loud. Just one word, steady and certain, but it froze me in place. I turned, and there she was, standing by her desk, watching me. She hadn't gathered her things yet. She hadn't even moved from her chair. But the way her eyes held mine told me she had been waiting for this moment. She rose slowly, each step deliberate as she crossed the room. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, echoing in the emptiness. My pulse quickened with every sound. When she reached my desk, she didn't speak at first. She simply placed one hand on the surface, her fingers spread lightly against the wood, only inches from where mine rested. Then she leaned in, closer than she ever had before. The scent of her perfume wrapped around me again, warm and familiar, mingling with the faint bitterness of coffee still in the air. Her hair fell slightly forward, and I could feel the whisper of it against my shoulder. She was close enough now that I could see the delicate lines at the corners of her eyes, the soft glow of her skin under the dim light. Close enough that every breath she took seemed to blend with mine. And then she said it. Don't look away. The words landed differently this time. Not as a command to test me, not as a challenge, but as something deeper, an invitation, a plea, a truth she wanted me to share with her. My instinct was to retreat, to let my gaze fall, to remind myself of the distance we were supposed to keep. But I didn't. I couldn't. So I met her eyes. And in that gaze, everything we hadn't said lived there. Respect, longing, restraint, desire, the fear of crossing a line, and the equal fear of never knowing what might happen if we did. My heart pounded so hard I was sure she could hear it. The air between us seemed to vibrate, alive with the tension of all we weren't saying. For a moment, the world shrank to just us. The desk beneath our hands, the soft glow of the lamps, the silence that carried more weight than any words. Neither of us moved further. Neither of us pulled back. We simply existed in that suspended space, staring into each other's eyes as though letting go would mean losing something we couldn't afford to lose. And in that fragile, breathless stillness, I knew something had broken. The wall between us wasn't gone, not yet. But there was a crack, wide enough for possibility to slip through. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Her hand rested on the desk near mine, her body leaning just close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence wrapping around me. My pulse thudded in my ears, my breath shallow, caught somewhere between restraint and surrender. And then, slowly, deliberately, she eased back. Not abruptly, not with finality, but with the same careful grace she carried in everything she did. Her eyes lingered on mine a heartbeat longer, as if reluctant to let go, before her expression softened into something I hadn't expected, a smile. Gentle, steady, and almost reassuring. The air around us shifted, the tension unraveling into something quieter, something steadier. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath, my shoulders dropping slightly as the invisible weight lifted. She straightened and reached for her bag on the desk. But before she turned away, her hand found my arm. Just lightly, her fingers brushing the fabric of my sleeve, resting there for a moment. It wasn't bold, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to ground me, to tell me that everything we had shared tonight hadn't been one-sided. Her touch was warm, firm enough to be felt, yet tender enough to make my chest ache with something I couldn't name. "Good night," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but threaded with something that sounded almost like care. "You did well today." The words weren't extraordinary. They weren't romantic confessions or promises. But the way she said them, the way her hand lingered on my arm just a fraction longer than necessary, made them feel heavier than anything else she could have spoken. I nodded, my throat dry, managing only a quiet, "Good night." She released me then, picking up her bag and walking toward the glass doors at the end of the office. I watched her silhouette framed by the glow of the city outside, every step measured, confident, the image of composure she always carried. And yet, tonight I had seen more. I had seen the flicker of vulnerability behind her strength. I had felt the warmth hidden beneath her professionalism. And for the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, the distance between us wasn't as impossible as it seemed. She paused at the door and glanced back. Just once. Her eyes found mine across the length of the room, and in that look, everything unsaid between us lingered. unspoken but understood. Then she turned and disappeared into the quiet hallway beyond. I sat there for a while, motionless, letting the silence settle around me again. The office felt empty without her, but the memory of her touch, her voice, her steady gaze, remained like a heartbeat in the room. When I finally stood to leave, I knew one thing for certain. Tonight had changed something. Not loudly, not in ways anyone else would notice, but in me, in her, in the fragile space between us, something had shifted, and it was only the beginning. If you felt the tension in this story, the quiet pull between two souls who shouldn't look away, then stay with me. Subscribe for more slow burn romances. Share this with someone who believes in subtle, unspoken love, and let me know in the comments what moment stayed with you the most.